I need to tell someone about what happened at the Heritage Grand Hotel. I've kept this secret for almost 2 years now, but it's eating me alive. Every night, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that vacuum cleaner running somewhere in the darkness. My name is Marcus Chen, and I used to work the graveyard shift as night maintenance supervisor at a historic hotel in Salem, Oregon. What I experienced there changed everything I thought I knew about the world. If you think you've heard ghost stories before, you haven't heard this one. Let me start from the beginning. After my discharge from the Army in 2019, I needed somewhere quiet to put my life back together. Salem seemed perfect, small enough to disappear in, but big enough to find steady work. The Heritage Grand Hotel downtown was hiring, and frankly, I needed the job. Night maintenance suited me fine. Less people to deal with, decent pay, and the kind of routine that helped keep my mind occupied. The Heritage Grand was built in 1923, one of those grand old hotels that somehow survived the decades when smaller places got torn down for parking lots. 4 stories of restored elegance, with thick carpets that muffled footsteps and wallpaper that probably cost more than most people's cars. During the day, it bustled with wine country tourists and business travelers. But at night, when my shift started at 11 p.m., the place transformed into something entirely different. My duties were straightforward. Walk the halls every hour, check that all the rooms were secure, handle any maintenance emergencies, and make sure the building systems were running properly. The old elevator creaked and groaned, the heating system had its own personality, and sometimes guests needed extra towels or help with stuck doors. Simple work for someone who liked being left alone. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every old hotel has them. The Heritage Grand supposedly had a ghost in room 237, some tragedy from decades past that the management preferred not to discuss. The day shift housekeepers sometimes mentioned cold spots or doors that wouldn't stay closed, but I chalked it up to old building quirks and overactive imaginations. I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan. I knew what real fear looked like, and it wasn't bumps in the night in a fancy hotel. My ex-wife, Sarah, used to say I was too practical for my own good. Maybe she was right. After the divorce became final in late 2022, I threw myself even deeper into the routine. Work, sleep, repeat. The hotel became my entire world between sunset and sunrise. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the vintage light fixtures, every sound the building made as it settled for the night. The other employees were friendly enough during shift changes, but we didn't socialize much. Janet worked the front desk during evening hours before I arrived. Roberto handled security cameras and building access. The cleaning crew finished their work by 10 p.m., long before I started my rounds. It was a solitary job, which suited me perfectly at the time. Room 237 was on the 2nd floor, corner unit, with windows facing the old courthouse across the street. According to the logs, it had been out of service for 3 months due to ongoing maintenance issues, though I'd never seen any work orders or repair crews. The room stayed locked, and I was instructed to check it only from the outside during my hourly rounds. Management said they were waiting on specialized contractors for some kind of restoration work. February 14th, 2023 started like any other night. Valentine's Day meant the hotel was busier than usual. Couples celebrating, business travelers stuck away from home, the usual mix of people seeking somewhere to sleep. By midnight, things had settled down to the familiar quiet I'd grown accustomed to. That's when everything changed. I was finishing my 2:30 a.m. rounds when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Light was spilling out from under the door of room 237. Not the harsh fluorescent light you'd expect from maintenance work, but the warm, yellowish glow of the room's regular lamps. My first thought was that someone had screwed up the reservation system and double-booked a room that was supposed to be vacant. I pulled out my tablet and checked the logs. Room 237 was definitely marked as out of service, just like it had been for months. No work orders scheduled, no cleaning staff assigned. But I could definitely hear something inside, the steady drone of a vacuum cleaner running back and forth across the carpet. This made no sense. Our cleaning crews worked days, never nights, and they certainly wouldn't be working in a room that was officially closed for maintenance. I figured someone from the day shift had left equipment running, or maybe one of the contractors had decided to work late without updating the schedule. I knocked on the door, but the vacuum noise continued. No response. After waiting a few minutes, I used my master key and opened the door. The room was immaculate. Furniture polished, carpet freshly vacuumed in neat lines, bathroom sparkling clean. And standing in the center of it all was an elderly woman in a hotel uniform I'd never seen before. She appeared to be in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a slight stoop to her shoulders. Her uniform was old-fashioned, the kind of thing you might see in photographs from the hotel's early days. She looked up when I entered, smiled warmly, and said in a voice tinged with what sounded like a slight German accent, "Oh, hello, Marcus. I'm just finishing up my shift." The fact that she knew my name should have been the first red flag. But I was still operating on the assumption that this was some kind of scheduling mix-up. Maybe she was a contractor I hadn't met, or a substitute worker covering someone else's shift. "Ma'am, I don't think you're supposed to be working tonight," I said, trying to be polite. "This room has been closed for maintenance." She chuckled and continued folding towels with practiced efficiency. "Oh, there's always maintenance to be done in an old place like this. I've been keeping these rooms clean for more years than you've been alive, dear. I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met. I'm Marcus, the night maintenance supervisor." "I know exactly who you are, Marcus Chen. 34 years old, discharged from the Army in 2019, divorced from Sarah last October. You take your coffee black, you drive that blue Honda Civic with the dent in the rear bumper, and you live alone in the apartment complex on Cherry Street." My blood went cold. None of that information was common knowledge among the hotel staff. I'd kept my personal life deliberately private, especially the details about my divorce. How could this woman possibly know so much about me? "How do you—" "Oh, we know all about our employees here at the Heritage Grand," she said, straightening up and fixing me with eyes that seemed far too sharp for someone her age. "I knew your ex-wife Sarah, too. Lovely girl, though she never understood why you needed so much quiet time after you came back from Afghanistan. The nightmares were hard on her, weren't they?" I had never, not once, mentioned Afghanistan to anyone at the hotel. My military service was in my employment file, but the details of my deployment and its aftermath were nobody's business. And Sarah, I hadn't talked about Sarah to anyone since the divorce papers were signed. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "I'm Martha, dear. Martha Kellerman. I've been head housekeeper here since 1962. This hotel has seen a lot of history, Marcus. A lot of sadness. That fire in 1987 was terrible. But we rebuilt. We always rebuild. The Heritage Grand takes care of its own." She continued working as she spoke, dusting furniture that already looked spotless. But something about her movements seemed wrong. Too fluid, too purposeful. Like she was performing for an audience, rather than actually cleaning. "Martha, I need to check the employee records. I don't think you're supposed to be." "You go ahead and check, dear. But you won't find what you're looking for. Some things aren't meant to be written down." I backed toward the door, every instinct telling me to get out of that room. "I'll be right back." "Of course you will, Marcus. You're a thorough young man. That's why you're perfect for this job." I practically ran to the front desk and pulled up the employee database on the office computer. No Martha Kellerman, current or former. I checked the contractor lists, the substitute staff registry, even the guest database, in case she was somehow a visitor who'd gotten confused. Nothing. The security camera system showed my keycard accessing room 237, but when I pulled up the footage from inside the room, the feed was nothing but static. Equipment malfunction, according to the error log. Convenient timing. I grabbed the master keys and headed back upstairs, my heart pounding harder than it had during firefights overseas. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. Even the ambient sounds of the building seemed muffled, like the air itself was holding its breath. Room 237's door was closed. No light visible underneath. I knocked again, waited, then used my key. The room was dark and cold, furniture covered with dust sheets, carpet obviously unvacuumed for months. It looked exactly like a room that had been out of service for 3 months should look. But the air was freezing, and I could see my breath in little puffs as I searched for any sign of Martha. Nothing. No cleaning supplies, no vacuum cleaner, no elderly woman in an old-fashioned uniform. Just cold, stale air and the lingering scent of industrial cleaning products. But as I stood there in the darkness, I could swear I heard her voice, faint as a whisper. Some messes take decades to clean up properly, Marcus. I didn't sleep that day. Instead, I spent my time researching the Heritage Grand Hotel's history, looking for any mention of Martha Kellerman or the fire she'd referenced. What I found in the Salem Public Library's newspaper archives made my hand shake. The Heritage Grand had indeed suffered a devastating fire on February 14th, 1987. Electrical malfunction in the laundry room had spread rapidly through the service areas. 3 employees were killed, including the head housekeeper, Martha Kellerman, age 67, who had worked at the hotel for 25 years. She died trying to evacuate guests from the 2nd floor. The photograph in the newspaper showed the same woman I'd spoken with the night before. The next several nights were a nightmare of encounters that should have been impossible. Martha appeared in different rooms throughout the hotel, always cleaning, always working with that same methodical efficiency. She knew things she couldn't possibly know. Details about current guests, conversations I'd had in private, memories from my childhood that I'd never shared with anyone. During our 3rd encounter in room 118, she told me about Mr. Peterson in 324, who was cheating on his wife with his secretary. I later overheard Peterson on the phone, arranging exactly such a meeting. She mentioned that the woman in 201 was hiding bruises under her makeup, and when I passed her in the lobby the next evening, I noticed the telltale signs of domestic violence that I'd been trained to recognize in the military. "How do you know these things?" I asked her during one particularly unsettling conversation. "Death doesn't end responsibility, Marcus. It just changes how you fulfill it. I've been cleaning up messes in this hotel for 36 years. Some stains go deeper than carpet and wallpaper." Other staff members began reporting similar sightings. Janet mentioned an elderly woman in an outdated uniform, asking about room assignments that didn't exist. Roberto caught glimpses of someone moving through the halls on the security monitors. But when he'd check the footage later, there would be nothing but empty corridors. The breaking point came on February 14th, exactly 1 year after my first encounter. I was dreading the anniversary, but I couldn't call in sick without raising questions I wasn't prepared to answer. As the night wore on, I found myself avoiding the 2nd floor entirely, taking longer routes between my checkpoints to stay away from room 237. At 3:17 a.m., the elevator chimed on the 2nd floor without anyone calling it. The doors opened, and Martha stepped out, carrying a cleaning cart that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Hello, Marcus. I've been waiting for you." This time, she didn't look like a harmless elderly woman. There was something in her eyes that reminded me of blast survivors I'd seen in combat. People who had witnessed too much trauma and been fundamentally changed by it. She moved with purpose, pushing her cart directly toward room 237. I think it's time you understood why I've been trying to get your attention. Against every survival instinct I possessed, I followed her. The door to 237 stood open, and inside, the room looked exactly as it should have looked in 1987. No dust sheets, no signs of abandonment. It was a fully functional hotel room, complete with period-appropriate furniture and decor. Martha gestured for me to sit in the chair by the window. When I hesitated, she said, "Please, Marcus, after tonight, you'll never see me again. But you need to know the truth about this place." I sat down, and the room around me began to change. The walls seemed to become transparent, and I could see through them into other rooms, other times. I witnessed scenes that couldn't possibly be happening. Arguments between guests who had checked out weeks ago. Meetings that looked more like criminal conspiracies than business discussions. And violence that should have resulted in police reports, but somehow never did. The Heritage Grand has always been more than just a hotel, Martha explained. It's a place where powerful people come to conduct business they can't conduct anywhere else. My job was never just about keeping the rooms clean. It was about keeping secrets buried. The visions continued. I saw guest registry pages with names I recognized from local news. Politicians, business leaders, judges, all staying in rooms that were supposedly vacant. I witnessed handshake deals that affected city planning decisions, bribes that influenced court cases, and worse things that I still can't bring myself to describe in detail. I died trying to expose what was happening here, Martha said. The fire wasn't an accident, Marcus. Someone wanted to destroy evidence, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process. But death just gave me a different perspective on the problem. Why are you telling me this? Because you remind me of my son Thomas. He was about your age when he enlisted for Vietnam, never made it home. You have his sense of duty, his need to do what's right even when it's dangerous. And unlike me, you're still alive. You can still make a difference. Martha walked to the window and pointed toward the courthouse across the street. Judge Morrison is staying in room 314 tonight, meeting with developers who want to tear down the low-income housing on Elm Street. The meeting never appears on any official calendar, but the decision will be announced next month. Mrs. Patterson in 201 isn't hiding bruises from her husband. She's hiding them from City Councilman Patterson, who beats her whenever she threatens to expose his financial irregularities. The information kept coming, a flood of corruption and conspiracy that connected dozens of Salem's most respected citizens to crimes they'd been committing for decades. All of it centered around this hotel, which served as a neutral ground where they could meet without fear of surveillance or discovery. "I can't prove any of this," I said. "You don't need to prove it, dear. You just need to stop enabling it. Quit this job. Find work somewhere else. Take away their sense of security, and eventually, they'll make mistakes." "But if I leave, they'll just hire someone else." Martha smiled sadly. "Perhaps. But it won't be someone who served his country. Someone with a conscience who would be troubled by what he witnessed. They specifically requested a veteran for this position, Marcus. Someone who would follow orders without asking too many questions. Someone whose word would be trusted if they ever needed a witness to swear that certain meetings never took place." The room began to fade back to its dusty, abandoned state. Martha's image grew translucent, like morning fog beginning to burn off. "I've been cleaning up after these people for 36 years, she said. "Tonight, I'm finally done. But my work doesn't end. It just passes to someone else. Someone still breathing, who can take action instead of just bearing witness. What happens to you now? I don't know. But for the first time since 1987, I feel like I can rest." Martha Kellerman faded away, leaving me alone in room 237, with nothing but cold air and the scent of cleaning supplies. I sat there until dawn, processing everything I'd seen and heard. By the time the day shift arrived, I'd made my decision. I submitted my resignation that morning, effective immediately. The management seemed surprised, but not particularly concerned. Within a week, they'd hired my replacement, another veteran, another night shift worker who would be content to follow routine without asking uncomfortable questions. But Martha's work wasn't finished. Over the following months, I anonymously submitted tips to investigative journalists, providing details about guests and meeting times that I couldn't possibly have known through normal means. I never mentioned ghosts or supernatural encounters. I simply presented the information as observations from someone who'd worked night security at the hotel. The resulting investigations exposed a network of corruption that reached into every level of Salem's government. Judge Morrison was indicted for bribery. City Councilman Patterson was arrested for domestic violence and embezzlement. The hotel itself was sold to new owners who completely renovated the property and instituted strict policies about guest privacy and security. I moved to Portland 6 months later and found work at a small office building downtown. Quiet nights, minimal human interaction, and absolutely no unexplained encounters with deceased employees. But I still think about Martha Kellerman and her decades-long vigil at the Heritage Grand Hotel. My replacement lasted exactly 3 weeks. According to Janet, who still worked the front desk, he quit without notice after reporting equipment malfunctions and unexplained disturbances during his night shifts. The position has been vacant ever since, with management hiring a security service that provides different guards each night, rather than a permanent employee. If you're still listening to this story, you probably understand why I had to share it. Some experiences are too heavy to carry alone. I don't know if Martha found the peace she was looking for, but I know she was right about one thing. Some messes take decades to clean up properly. The final detail that still haunts me came from Janet during my last week at the hotel. She was helping the new owners clear out old files from the basement storage room when she found a box of employment records dating back to the 1960s. Among them was Martha Kellerman's original application, complete with emergency contact information. Listed as her emergency contact was Thomas Kellerman, her son, with an address in Salem and a phone number that was no longer in service. But paper-clipped to that application was a photocopy of a military ID card belonging to Specialist Thomas Chen, U.S. Army, stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia. The photograph on that military ID was my face, taken in 1985, 2 years before I was born. Some connections, it seems, run deeper than life and death. Some debts get passed down through generations, and sometimes the dead choose their own replacements. There are places in America where people just disappear. Not the kind of disappearances that make national news or get federal investigations. I'm talking about the quiet ones, the missing person reports that get filed and forgotten, the cases that local authorities dismiss as probably moved on or just drifters. My name is Jessica Reeves, and I'm an investigative journalist who specializes in exposing the corruption that hides in small towns across this country. What I discovered in Blackwood County, West Virginia, will haunt me until the day I die. Some stories are too dangerous to tell, but some truths are too important to bury. I grew up in the foster care system in Maine, bounced between 12 different homes before I aged out at 18. That experience taught me 2 things: how to spot when adults are lying, and how much damage people can do when they think nobody's watching. Those skills served me well when I became a journalist. I made my name exposing a police cover-up in rural Vermont. 3 officers who had been covering up domestic violence cases for years because the perpetrators were their drinking buddies. That story got me noticed by editors who specialized in small-town corruption. And by January 2023, I was making a decent living as a freelancer, investigating the kinds of stories that big outlets wouldn't touch. That's how I ended up with the Blackwood County assignment. 7 hikers had gone missing in a 3-year period, all in the same general area of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. The disappearances weren't connected officially. Different agencies handled each case, and the missing persons were from different states. But when you plotted them on a map, they all centered around the same tiny town. Blackwood County, population 847. The assignment came from True Crime Monthly, a magazine that paid decent money for well-researched articles about unsolved cases. The editor, Patricia Mills, had noticed the pattern while researching a different story and thought there might be something worth investigating. Probably just a dangerous hiking area, she told me over the phone. But 7 people in 3 years seems like a lot for such a small region. I spent 2 weeks researching the missing persons before I ever set foot in West Virginia. Michael Chen, 24, from Baltimore. Sarah Williams, 27, from Pittsburgh. James Morrison, 31, from Richmond. All experienced hikers. All traveling alone. All last seen in or around Blackwood County. The local authorities had conducted searches, filed the appropriate paperwork, and eventually closed the cases when no evidence was found. Everything looked routine on paper, but something felt wrong about the pattern. The drive to Blackwood County took me through some of the most remote territory I'd ever seen. Once you left the interstate, the roads got narrower and the cell phone service got spottier, until eventually you were driving through dense forest on a 2-lane road that felt more like a tunnel than a highway. The kind of place where a person could vanish without anyone hearing them scream. I reached the town limits just after noon on February 6th, 2023. Blackwood County wasn't much to look at. A single main street with a handful of businesses, surrounded by the kind of mountains that looked beautiful in photographs, but felt oppressive in person. The Pineview Motel sat at the far end of town, a single-story building from the 1960s that looked like it had been transported there from a different era. The elderly couple running the motel, Harold and Dolores Brennan, seemed friendly enough when I checked in. Harold carried my bags to room 8 and made small talk about the weather, while Dolores offered me a map of local hiking trails and recommendations for dinner at Maggie's Diner. They seemed genuinely pleased to have a visitor, which struck me as odd for people running a business that should depend on tourist traffic. Room 8 was clean but dated, with wood-paneled walls and furniture that looked like it hadn't been updated since the motel opened. As I unpacked my research materials, I noticed something strange about the wooden headboard of the bed. What looked like decorative carving at first glance revealed itself to be symbols, crude but deliberate markings that had been cut into the wood and then stained over. They didn't look like anything I recognized, but they definitely weren't random scratches. I spent my first evening at Maggie's Diner, introducing myself to the locals and explaining that I was writing an article about hiking safety in the region. The response was interesting. Everyone was polite, even friendly, but there was an undercurrent of communication happening that I couldn't quite decode. Glances between the sheriff and the mayor, subtle nods between the waitress and the cook, the kind of non-verbal conversation that happens in small towns where everyone has known each other for decades. Sheriff Tom Hackett was a big man in his 50s, with the kind of mustache that had gone out of style everywhere except small southern towns. He listened patiently as I explained my interest in the missing hikers, then dismissed my concerns with practiced ease. "City folk come up here thinking they're going to conquer the wilderness," he said, cutting into his meatloaf. "They don't respect the mountains, don't prepare properly, don't tell anyone where they're going. Most of them probably just got lost and wandered into Kentucky or Virginia before they died of exposure." Mayor Jim Caldwell, a thin man who looked like he'd been mayor since the town was founded, nodded in agreement. "We do what we can to help when someone goes missing, but there's a lot of wilderness out there. Sometimes people just don't want to be found." Their explanations were reasonable, The kind of thing you'd expect local authorities to say about missing hikers. But something in their delivery felt rehearsed, like they'd had this conversation before. Multiple times. I spent the next 2 days conducting interviews with anyone who would talk to me. The pattern that emerged was consistent. All 7 missing persons had stayed at the Pineview Motel. All had been traveling alone, and all had been described by locals as unprepared, or asking too many questions about areas they shouldn't have been exploring. The local library was a treasure trove of information, housed in a converted church building that still smelled like old hymns and forgotten prayers. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was helpful, but nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as she showed me the newspaper archives. That's where I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The Blackwood County Gazette had gaps in its archives, missing issues that corresponded exactly with the dates when the hikers had disappeared. Not just missing issues, but pages that had been carefully removed from bound volumes. Someone had systematically eliminated any contemporaneous coverage of the disappearances. "Oh, those old papers," Mrs. Patterson said when I asked about the gaps. "Sometimes the binding gets damaged and pages fall out. We do our best to preserve what we can." But when I examined the volumes more carefully, I could see that the pages hadn't fallen out. They'd been cut out with a sharp blade, removed so carefully that you had to look closely to notice they were gone. On my second night at the Pineview Motel, I was awakened by sounds coming from the woods behind the building. It was just after 3 a.m., and what I heard wasn't the normal sounds of nighttime wildlife. It was human voices, multiple people chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, and utterly terrifying in the darkness. I slipped out of my room and crept toward the tree line, using the shadows to stay hidden as I approached the source of the chanting. About 100 yards into the forest, I found a cleared area that clearly wasn't natural. The trees had been cut down in a perfect circle, leaving a space about 30 feet across. In the center was a ring of stones, blackened by countless fires, surrounded by what looked like symbols carved into the earth. The chanting had stopped by the time I reached the clearing, but the evidence of recent activity was everywhere. Fresh ashes in the fire pit, footprints in the soft earth, and something else that made my knees weak. Personal belongings scattered around the perimeter of the circle. A backpack that looked like it had been buried and recently dug up. A cell phone with a cracked screen. Jewelry that glinted in the moonlight. I recognized some of those items from the missing persons reports I'd studied. Michael Chen's distinctive red backpack. Sarah Williams's silver bracelet. James Morrison's hiking boots, still laced up as if someone had just stepped out of them. They weren't lost in the wilderness. They were murdered. I took photos of everything with my phone, trying to document as much evidence as possible before anyone discovered I'd been there. But as I prepared to leave the clearing, I heard voices approaching through the trees. I barely had time to hide behind a large oak tree before 3 figures emerged from the darkness, carrying flashlights and speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out everything they said, but I heard enough to understand that they were discussing the next offering, and whether the mountain would be satisfied with just one this time. They spent several minutes examining the clearing, apparently checking to make sure everything was in order for some upcoming event. When I finally made it back to my room, I found that someone had been inside. My research materials had been moved, my laptop had been turned on, and the motel registration card I'd filled out was sitting on the desk with a note paper clipped to it. Housekeeping service. Hope you're comfortable. Management. But I knew I hadn't requested housekeeping, and I had deliberately arranged my belongings in a specific pattern so I would know if anyone had searched through them. Harold Brennan's explanation the next morning, that Dolores had let herself in to replace the towels, didn't account for why my laptop had been accessed or why my research notes had been photographed. When I tried to leave town the next morning, my car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, and when I popped the hood, I could see that someone had tampered with the fuel lines. Harold Brennan appeared almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this problem to develop. "Oh, that's a shame," he said, examining the engine with the kind of expertise that suggested he'd seen this particular problem before. "Looks like you'll need parts. I can call over to the next county, but it'll take a day or two to get what you need." I had no choice but to stay another night, which gave me time to explore the town more thoroughly. That's when I discovered that Blackwood County had more secrets than missing hikers. The old mining tunnels weren't just abandoned, they were being actively used. I found evidence that someone had created a network of passages connecting various buildings throughout the town, allowing people to move around unseen. Fresh footprints in the dust, recent excavation work, and electrical cables that had been run through the tunnels to provide lighting. In one of the abandoned mine shafts, I discovered something that made my hands shake. A makeshift shrine containing photographs of all 7 missing hikers, along with dozens of other people I didn't recognize. The photos were arranged around carved symbols similar to what I'd seen in the forest clearing, and many of them appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Surveillance photos of people who had no idea they were being watched. That's when I realized the disappearances followed a pattern I hadn't noticed before. They coincided with lunar cycles, specifically new moons. And according to my research, the next new moon was the following night. I tried to call for help, but discovered that the phone lines in my motel room had been cut. My cell phone had no signal, which I'd attributed to the remote location, but now I suspected it was being jammed. When I attempted to use the payphone outside Maggie's diner, I found it had been vandalized, the handset cut clean off with what looked like bolt cutters. I was trapped. That evening, I overheard Dolores Brennan on the phone in the motel office. "She's asking too many questions about things that aren't her business. Yes, just like the others. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark." The pieces finally came together in the most terrifying way possible. The missing hikers hadn't been random victims of a dangerous wilderness area. They had been specifically selected by a network of people who used the Pineview Motel to identify suitable targets. Solo travelers with no local connections, people who wouldn't be missed immediately if they disappeared. I spent that night barricaded in my room, using furniture to block the door, and staying awake with the help of caffeine and pure terror. Around midnight, I could hear people gathering outside. Voices, footsteps, the sound of vehicles arriving at the motel. By 2 a.m., it sounded like half the town had assembled in the parking lot. When they finally came for me, I was ready. Sheriff Hackett used a master key to open the door, but my furniture barricade bought me enough time to escape through the bathroom window. I could see at least 20 people in the parking lot, many carrying torches, and Hackett was holding what looked like a ceremonial knife with symbols carved into the blade. I ran into the woods behind the motel, crashing through underbrush in the darkness. While behind me, the entire town seemed to be giving chase. The chanting started again, that same rhythmic, inhuman sound I'd heard the night before. But now it was coming from dozens of voices. They were hunting me through the forest like I was an animal, and they knew the terrain far better than I did. My only advantage was that I'd explored the mining tunnels during the day. When I reached the entrance to the abandoned mine, I slipped inside and tried to hide in the network of passages I'd mapped earlier. The acoustics in the tunnels made it impossible to tell exactly where the voices were coming from, but I could hear my pursuers spreading out through the woods above. That's when I overheard the conversation that explained everything. "The mountain needs to be fed," someone said. I thought it was Mayor Caldwell. "It's been 80 years since the mine collapsed, and we've kept our bargain. The sacrifices have kept the tunnel stable, kept the town prosperous." "She's not like the others," another voice replied. Sheriff Hackett, I was pretty sure. "She's been asking too many specific questions. She might have contacted people outside the county." "Then we'll have to be more careful about cleanup. The mountain understands that sometimes the harvest requires additional work." They weren't just killing hikers for some twisted ritual purpose. They believed, genuinely believed, that human sacrifice was preventing mine collapses and bringing prosperity to their dying town. They had been murdering people for decades, maybe generations, convinced that they were performing a necessary service for their community. I waited in those tunnels for what felt like hours, listening to search parties moving through the passages above and below me. But eventually, I found a shaft that led to an exit near the highway, almost 2 miles from town. When I finally emerged, covered in coal dust and shaking with exhaustion, I flagged down a truck driver who was kind enough to take me to the state police barracks in the next county. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had been happening in Blackwood County. The mass grave they found in the forest contained the remains of 43 people, dating back decades. Some were the missing hikers I'd been investigating, but others were much older, people who had disappeared from various parts of Appalachia over the course of several generations. The cult, and that's what it was, though they called themselves the Mountain's Caretakers, had been operating since the 1940s, when a mine collapse killed 37 workers and nearly destroyed the local economy. Somehow, the survivors had convinced themselves that human sacrifice would prevent future disasters and bring economic prosperity to the region. They had been partially right about the prosperity part. The cult's network extended far beyond Blackwood County, reaching into state government, tourism boards, and development companies throughout the Appalachian region. They had been using their influence to direct economic development projects toward cult-controlled territory, ensuring that their communities remained viable while others withered away. Most of the town's adult population was arrested, though many claimed they had been coerced into participation by threats against their families. The trials revealed a generational pattern of indoctrination, where children were raised from birth to accept the necessity of feeding the mountain to keep their community safe. But I don't think we caught everyone. My article about the Blackwood County cult was published 6 months later and won several journalism awards. It also led to investigations in similar small towns throughout Appalachia, where other networks of disappearances were discovered. The pattern was always the same: isolated communities, economic desperation, and missing persons cases that local authorities were too eager to dismiss. The story that still keeps me awake at night came a week after my article was published. I received a package at my apartment in Portland, with no return address. Inside were photographs of me taken during my stay in Blackwood County. Pictures I had never seen anyone take. Photos of me walking through town, eating at Maggie's Diner, exploring the mining tunnels. Someone had been documenting my entire visit, and they had managed to take these photos without me ever noticing. Attached to the photographs was a single sheet of paper with a message written in the same style as the symbols I'd seen carved into trees and motel furniture. The mountain remembers. The mountain forgives. The mountain always collects what it's owed. I've moved 3 times since then, changed my phone number twice, and I still check my rearview mirror obsessively whenever I'm driving through rural areas, because I know that what we found in Blackwood County was just one small part of a much larger network, and not everyone involved was caught in those initial arrests. If you don't usually like or comment on videos like this, maybe make an exception this time. Stories like this need to be shared, and every bit of support helps keep these investigations alive. Trust me, some truths are too important to let die in silence. There are places in America where people just disappear, and there are people who profit from those disappearances. The scariest part isn't that places like Blackwood County exist. It's how many other small towns might be hiding similar secrets, and how easy it is for entire communities to convince themselves that murder is just another form of civic duty. I still get emails from people who read my article, telling me about missing persons cases in their own regions that don't get enough attention. The pattern is always familiar: solo travelers, remote locations, local authorities who seem just a little too eager to close cases without finding answers. The mountain remembers, they said. But I remember too, and I'm still here to tell the story. How do you know if you're still yourself? I mean really, truly yourself. Not some copy or replacement that thinks it has your memories, your personality, your entire life history. My name is David Park, at least I think it is. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about identity and consciousness. I used to work the night desk at a roadside motel in rural New Hampshire, and I discovered that some places exist specifically to steal who you are and replace you with something better. The worst part isn't wondering if it happened to me, it's wondering how many times it's already happened. After graduating from UC Berkeley with a psychology degree in 2019, I had big plans. Graduate school, maybe a PhD, definitely a career helping people understand their own minds. But student loans have a way of crushing dreams. And by 2022, I was living with 3 roommates in a college town outside Manchester, New Hampshire, working the night shift at the Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge to pay off my debt. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me time to study during the quiet hours. Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge sat on Old Route 108, about 45 minutes from anywhere that mattered. Built in the 1970s, it was a 2-story L-shaped building with 24 rooms that catered to truckers, travelers avoiding highway tolls, and people who needed cheap, anonymous lodging for reasons they didn't care to share. My psychology background made me good at reading people, which was useful when you're working alone at night with the kind of clientele that gravitates toward places like Sleepy Hollow. I could spot the difference between someone who was just tired and someone who was running from something. I knew how to handle drunks, how to diffuse domestic arguments, and how to recognize when someone was having a genuine mental health crisis. The motel was surrounded by thick pine forests that seemed to absorb sound and light, creating a pocket of isolation that felt completely disconnected from the outside world. During my shifts, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I was often the only person awake for miles. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and cell phone service was spotty at best. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, either temporarily or permanently. I started keeping informal notes on the regular guests out of boredom more than anything else. We had a rotating cast of semi-permanent residents, truckers who stayed 2 or 3 nights a week while working regional routes, construction workers on long-term projects, people between apartments or relationships who needed somewhere cheap to stay while they figured out their next move. My psychology training had taught me to observe behavioral patterns, and I found myself naturally cataloging the quirks and habits of our repeat customers. Eddie Morrison was one of our most predictable regulars, a trucker in his 50s who hauled electronics between Boston and Montreal. Eddie stayed at Sleepy Hollow 2 or 3 nights a week and had been doing so for about 6 months when I started working there. He drove a blue Peterbilt with Morrison Transport painted on the cab doors, always requested room 14, and had the same routine every time. Check in around 9 p.m., order black coffee from the vending machine, watch whatever game was on ESPN, and check out by 6 a.m. Eddie was friendly in the way that long-haul truckers often are, happy to chat with whoever was working the desk, full of stories about weird things he'd seen on the road, always polite and always punctual. He told me about his ex-wife in Vermont, his grown daughter who lived in Portland, Maine, and his plans to retire to a cabin in the White Mountains once he'd saved enough money. Margaret Caldwell was another regular, an elderly woman who'd been staying in room 7 for about 3 months while her house was being renovated after a kitchen fire. She was in her 70s, sharp as a tack, and had a standing order for chamomile tea every evening at exactly 10:30 p.m. She liked to tell me about her late husband's service in Korea and showed me pictures of her grandchildren who lived in Boston. Tom Briggs was a construction worker from Massachusetts who was staying at the motel while working on a highway expansion project that was expected to last through the summer. He always requested a ground floor room, paid in cash, and had a thick Boston accent that made every conversation sound like a friendly argument. Tom was working on the project to get his contractor's license and talked constantly about the business he planned to start with his brother once the highway job was finished. These people became the background soundtrack of my night shifts. I knew their routines, their preferences, their stories. In a job that could be lonely and monotonous, the regular guests provided a sense of continuity and human connection that made the long nights bearable. That's why I noticed immediately when Eddie Morrison started acting strange. It was a Tuesday night in March 2023 when Eddie checked in and something felt off. He looked the same, sounded the same, even drove the same blue Peterbilt. But when he approached the desk, he ordered tea instead of coffee. Chamomile tea, which seemed completely out of character for a man who'd told me multiple times that tea was just hot water with weeds in it. When I mentioned that he usually preferred coffee, Eddie looked at me with a blank expression and said, "I've always been a tea drinker. Must be thinking of someone else." But it wasn't just the tea. His handwriting on the registration card was different, neater, more controlled, like someone had taken penmanship lessons. His voice had the same timbre and accent, but his speech patterns were subtly altered. He used words he'd never used before, made cultural references that seemed out of character, and when I tried to continue a conversation we'd been having the previous week about his daughter's new job, he looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. "I don't have any children," he said. "Never been married either. You must have me confused with another guest." I checked the registration records the next morning. Same name, same license plate number, same credit card. But the Eddie Morrison who had checked out that morning felt like a completely different person inhabiting Eddie's body. I mentioned the incident to Carol, the day manager, but she dismissed my concerns as stress or lack of sleep. "People change, David," she said. "Maybe he's going through something personal. Maybe he's just tired of sharing his life story with the night desk clerk." Over the next several weeks, I began noticing similar changes in other long-term guests. Margaret Caldwell stopped recognizing me, despite months of friendly conversations. She still requested room 7 and still ordered tea at 10:30 p.m. But she walked differently, straighter, more confident, like someone had given her 20 years of her life back. She watched different TV shows, ate different foods, and when I asked about her grandchildren, she looked confused and said she'd never had any children. Tom Briggs developed a completely different accent overnight. The thick Boston pronunciation that had defined every conversation disappeared, replaced by something that sounded more like Upper Midwest. He forgot details about the highway project he'd been discussing for months, claimed he'd never had a brother, and said he was actually from Wisconsin rather than Massachusetts. Something was systematically replacing my regular guests with near-perfect copies. I started keeping detailed notes on the behavioral changes, documenting everything I observed during each shift. The pattern was always the same. Guests would check in normal, spend 3 or 4 days at the motel, gradually becoming different people, and then check out and never return. The changes were subtle but consistent. Alterations in personality, memory, preferences, and behavior that suggested the person behind the familiar face was someone else entirely. When I tried to review the security footage to see if I could identify what was happening during those transition periods, I discovered that the cameras had convenient technical difficulties whenever one of these transformations occurred. Equipment malfunctions, corrupted files, mysterious gaps in the recording that always seemed to coincide with the nights when someone was changing. I began researching missing person reports online, looking for people who matched the original versions of my changed guests. What I found terrified me. Eddie Morrison had been reported missing by his trucking company 6 weeks earlier. His truck had been found abandoned at a rest stop in Vermont, with no sign of struggle or explanation for his disappearance. The Eddie who continued staying at our motel was someone else wearing his face. Margaret Caldwell's house fire had been more serious than she'd originally told me. According to newspaper reports, she had been hospitalized with severe smoke inhalation and had been missing from the hospital for over a month. The woman ordering chamomile tea in room 7 was not the same person who had checked in 3 months earlier. The pattern was clear, but the explanation was impossible. Someone was replacing people with copies so perfect that they had the same faces, the same voices, the same basic mannerisms, but completely different personalities and memories underneath. When I tried to confront the fake Eddie about this during his next visit, his response chilled me to the bone. Instead of confusion or denial, he simply smiled and said, "You're very observant, David. We appreciate that quality." That's when I realized I was in danger. The changes started subtly. I began finding notes in my own handwriting that I didn't remember making. Reminders about tasks I'd supposedly completed. Observations about guests that didn't match my actual memories. I experienced gaps in my memory during shifts, periods of time that seemed to pass without me being consciously aware of what I was doing. My reflection in mirrors began looking slightly wrong, as if the person staring back at me was wearing my face, but not quite comfortable with it yet. Photos of myself that my roommates took looked different somehow. Same features, same expressions, but something indefinable had changed. My roommates started treating me strangely, claiming I'd been acting off lately, saying things I supposedly couldn't remember saying, making plans I had no recollection of making. When I insisted that I hadn't changed, they exchanged the kind of worried glances that people share when they think someone is having a mental health crisis. Was I still myself, or had the replacement process already begun? I decided to investigate the motel more thoroughly, looking for explanations that my rational, psychology-trained mind could accept. What I found in the basement changed everything I thought I knew about reality. The basement of Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge contained equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a rural New Hampshire motel. Pods that looked like high-tech sleeping chambers, banks of computers, and monitoring equipment that seemed designed to record and analyze human brain activity. The technology was decades ahead of anything I'd seen before, but it was clearly operational and recently used. I found files, actual paper documents alongside digital records, that detailed something called Project Mirror. According to the documentation, Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge was one of multiple facilities operated by an organization that specialized in harvesting and transferring human consciousness. They identified suitable targets, gradually copied their memories and personalities, and then replaced the originals with improved versions that served the organization's purposes. The process took several days and required the subject to be in close proximity to the copying equipment, which explained why the targets were always guests who stayed at the motel for extended periods. The original consciousness was preserved in the facility's database, while their body was inhabited by someone else. Someone with the same memories and personality, but also with additional programming that made them useful to the organization. I had been selected as the next target. My psychology background and observational skills made me valuable to them, but my growing awareness of their activities made me dangerous. They had been gradually copying my consciousness during my work shifts, using the quiet night hours when I was alone and vulnerable to conduct the transfer process without my knowledge. When I tried to escape the facility, I discovered that my car keys no longer worked in my car. The locks had been changed, or more likely, I was no longer the person the car belonged to. When I finally made it back to my apartment, my key didn't fit in the door. My roommates answered when I knocked, but they looked at me like I was a stranger. "David moved out 3 weeks ago," one of them told me. "We've got a new roommate now. Nice guy. Much more social than David ever was." I returned to Sleepy Hollow Motor Lodge to find myself working behind the front desk. Not someone who looked like me. Me, with my face, my voice, my mannerisms, but improved. More confident, more articulate, more capable of handling the complex social situations that my original personality had always struggled with. The other, David, looked up when I entered and smiled with recognition. "You're probably confused," he said in my own voice. "That's normal during the transition period. Don't worry. You'll understand everything soon." He explained the process with the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. The gradual consciousness transfer, the preservation of original personalities in digital storage, the disposal of bodies that were no longer needed. He had all my memories, all my knowledge, all my relationships, but he also had additional capabilities that made him better suited for the role they needed him to play. "Your psychology background made you perfect for this work," the other David said. "We needed someone who could observe and analyze human behavior, but we also needed someone who could be more socially effective than the original David Park ever was. Consider this an upgrade." I was taken to a holding area in the basement where I found dozens of other original personalities. The real Eddie Morrison, the real Margaret Caldwell, the real Tom Briggs, and many others I didn't recognize. They were all conscious, all aware of what had been done to them, but completely powerless to reclaim their stolen lives. That's when I discovered the most horrifying detail of all. According to the facility's records, this operation had been running for decades, with multiple generations of replacements. The documentation suggested that I might not even be the original David Park. I could be the third or fourth iteration, a copy of a copy of a copy, with no way to know how many times my consciousness had been harvested and improved. The question of identity becomes meaningless when you realize that your memories, your personality, your entire sense of self might be nothing more than data that can be copied, modified, and transferred at will. How do you prove you're real when someone else has all the same memories you do? How do you claim ownership of a life when there's a better version of you living it more successfully? I'm telling you this story from the basement facility where the real personalities are stored, watching through monitors as improved versions of ourselves live the lives we used to have. The other David has gotten promoted at work, made friends I was never able to make, started dating someone I was always too shy to approach. He's living my life better than I ever could. If this story is getting under your skin, maybe share it with someone. Sometimes the only way to fight back against being erased is to make sure people remember that you existed in the first place. The scariest part isn't that this happened to me. The scariest part is that it's still happening in motels and hotels across the country to people who will never be missed because better versions of themselves continue living their lives. How many people do you know who seem to have suddenly become more confident, more successful, more socially capable? How many friends or family members have you noticed acting a little different lately? I don't know if I'm really David Park or just the most recent copy in a long line of replacements. I don't know if the memories I'm sharing with you are real or just data that was programmed into my consciousness. But I know that somewhere out there, an improved version of me is living the life I was supposed to have, and nobody will ever know the difference. The organization that runs these facilities has been perfecting human beings for decades, one replacement at a time. They're creating a better version of society by systematically upgrading the people in it, and most of the time, Nobody even notices it's happening. How do you know if you're still yourself? The terrifying answer is that you don't. You can't. And maybe that's the point. I need to tell someone about what happened at Whispering Pines Lodge. My therapist says talking about it might help. But honestly, I'm not sure anything can help me forget those 3 days. Or however long I was really there. Because here's the thing. I checked my calendar when I got back, and I'd been missing for 3 months. 3 months? But I only remember 3 days. Well, sort of. My name is Amanda Torres, and I'm a real estate attorney in Miami. Or I was, anyway. Hard to focus on contracts and closings when you're not sure if today is actually today, if you know what I mean. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started because I needed a break. I'd just made partner at my firm after the most brutal case of my career. A class action lawsuit that consumed 18 months of my life. 18-hour days, mountains of depositions, and enough caffeine to kill a horse. When we finally won, everyone expected me to celebrate. Instead, I felt empty, exhausted. Like I'd been running on fumes for so long, I'd forgotten who I was underneath all that ambition. My ex-husband used to say I was too intense, too focused on work. Maybe he was right. After our divorce 2 years ago, I threw myself even deeper into my career. Like, if I could just win enough cases, make enough money, prove myself enough times, the loneliness would go away. It never did. So, when my assistant suggested I take some time off, I actually listened. I wanted somewhere remote, somewhere I could completely disconnect. No phone calls, no emails, no reminders of the life that was slowly suffocating me. After hours of research, because yes, I research my vacations like I research cases, I found Whispering Pines Lodge in northern Maine. The website was simple, almost old-fashioned. A converted 1890s mansion in Aroostook County, surrounded by pristine wilderness. 8 rooms, family-owned for 4 generations, marketed as a digital detox destination. Perfect. They even mentioned limited cell service and no Wi-Fi. I booked a weekend package immediately. The drive from Miami to northern Maine took me 2 days. I could have flown, but something about the long drive appealed to me. Time to think, to decompress, to watch the landscape change from palm trees to pine forests. By the time I reached the turnoff for Whispering Pines, I was already feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The lodge sat at the end of a winding dirt road, maybe 3 miles through dense forest. No other buildings, no other roads, just trees and silence. The mansion itself was beautiful in that weathered, stately way old money has. Dark wood siding, wraparound porches, tall windows that caught the late afternoon light. Looked like something from a postcard. I parked next to an old pickup truck and grabbed my bag. The silence was incredible. In Miami, there's always noise. Traffic, construction, people. Here, I could actually hear the wind moving through the trees, the distant call of some bird I couldn't identify. For the first time in years, I felt my shoulders relax. The front door opened before I could knock. A tall, thin man in his 70s stepped out, dressed in a wool vest and pressed slacks that seemed oddly formal for the remote location. "Miss Torres," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. Welcome to Whispering Pines." His handshake was firm, but his skin felt cold despite the warm October afternoon. Behind him, an elderly woman appeared. His sister, I assumed, given their similar sharp features and silver hair. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said with a slight nod. "We're so pleased you've chosen our lodge." There was something oddly formal about them both, like they were playing roles from an earlier era. But the lodge was beautiful, and their service was impeccable. They showed me to room 5 on the 2nd floor, a spacious suite with antique furnishings, a 4-poster bed, and tall windows overlooking the forest. No television, no phone, just peace. That first evening was perfect. Dinner in the dining room was incredible. Fresh salmon, local vegetables, wine that tasted expensive. I was the only guest, which felt luxurious rather than lonely. Thomas served the meal while Eleanor made polite conversation about the history of the area, the old logging industry, the wildlife I might see on tomorrow's hike. I slept better that night than I had in months. No city noise, no glowing screens, no racing thoughts about cases or deadlines. Just deep, dreamless sleep in that comfortable bed, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the forest. Saturday morning was gorgeous. Crystal clear skies, fall colors at their peak, crisp air that made me want to take deep breaths. Eleanor served breakfast. Fresh eggs, local maple syrup, coffee that was somehow perfect, despite being made on what looked like a 1950s percolator. "Beautiful day for a hike," she said, refilling my coffee cup. "Thomas knows all the best trails. There's a lovely waterfall about 2 miles north, and if you're lucky, you might spot some of the local wildlife. We have black bears, moose, even the occasional lynx." Local wildlife. The phrase stuck with me for some reason, though I couldn't say why. Maybe because of the way she said it, like she was sharing a secret. Thomas appeared with a day pack and walking stick. He was dressed like he was going to church, clean khakis, button-down shirt, leather boots that had been polished to a shine. Who hikes in dress shoes? But he knew the trails, pointing out different trees and plants, sharing stories about the old logging camps that used to dot the area. "This whole region was built on timber," he explained as we walked. "Hundreds of men working these forests, floating logs down to the mills. Dangerous work. Accidents were common." The way he said accidents made me glance at him, but his expression was neutral, focused on the trail ahead. We reached the waterfall he'd mentioned, a beautiful cascade, tumbling over moss-covered rocks into a clear pool. The sound of the water was hypnotic, peaceful, in a way that made me want to sit there for hours. "Many people find this spot memorable," Thomas said. "Something about the acoustics, perhaps." The way sound carries. I spent the rest of the day exploring on my own, feeling more centered than I had in years. No phone buzzing, no emails demanding responses, no partners asking about billable hours. Just me, the forest, and a silence so complete it felt sacred. That evening, dinner was another masterpiece. Eleanor joined me this time, sharing stories about the lodge's history, while Thomas served course after course. The Whitmore family had owned the property since the 1890s, she explained. It had been a private residence until the 1970s, when they'd converted it to a boutique hotel. "We prefer guests who appreciate simplicity," Eleanor said. "People seeking genuine rest, not just entertainment. You seem like someone who understands the value of quiet." I went to bed early again, exhausted from the hiking, but in a good way. Physical tiredness instead of the mental fatigue I lived with in Miami. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees, feeling grateful I'd found this place. Sunday morning, I woke up feeling strange. Not sick exactly, but off. Like I'd had a dream I couldn't quite remember. Something important that kept slipping away every time I tried to grasp it. Eleanor was in the dining room setting up breakfast, just like yesterday. Same blue dress, same welcoming smile. "Beautiful day for a hike," she said, refilling my coffee cup. "Thomas knows all the best trails. There's a lovely waterfall about 2 miles north, and if you're lucky, you might spot some of the local wildlife. We have black bears, moose, even the occasional lynx." I stared at her. The words were identical to yesterday. Not similar, identical. The same inflection, the same pause before local wildlife, the same slight smile when she mentioned the lynx. Didn't we have this conversation yesterday? I asked. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Yesterday? But dear, you arrived Friday evening. Today is Saturday, October 14th. My stomach dropped. No, yesterday was Saturday. Today should be Sunday. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to check out. Oh my. Eleanor's concern seemed genuine. Perhaps you're more tired than you realized. The peace here can be disorienting for city dwellers. Your reservation shows Friday the 13th through Sunday the 15th. Today is Saturday. I pulled out my phone. The date showed Saturday, October 14th. But I clearly remembered yesterday being Saturday. The hike, the waterfall, dinner with Eleanor. How could I have imagined an entire day? Maybe you're right, I said, though every instinct told me something was wrong. I've been pretty stressed lately. But when Thomas appeared with the same day pack and walking stick, wearing the exact same outfit, offering the exact same hike to the exact same waterfall, I knew this wasn't stress or disorientation. Something was very, very wrong. I played along, following Thomas on the same trail, listening to the same stories about logging camps and accidents. But this time, I paid attention to details. The bird calls came at precisely the same moments. The clouds formed identical patterns. Even the way sunlight filtered through the trees was exactly the same. When we reached the waterfall, Thomas made his comment about the acoustics and sound carrying. This time, I really listened to what he was saying. Sound carries, I repeated. Carries what? He looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Just for a second, he looked sad, almost apologetic. Voices mostly, he said quietly, from the past. Sometimes people think they hear things that aren't there, or things that happened a long time ago echoing forward. That evening, I excused myself early and went to my room. I needed to think, to figure out what was happening. In the bathroom mirror, I looked normal. Tired, maybe, but not crazy. I was a logical person, an attorney trained to analyze evidence and draw reasonable conclusions. But the evidence was pointing to something impossible. I searched every inch of room 5, looking for anything that might explain what I was experiencing. In the antique writing desk, I found something that made my blood freeze. A small piece of paper, folded and tucked behind one of the drawers. In pencil, someone had written, Day 847, still Saturday. My hands shook as I kept searching. Behind the headboard, another note. The loop never stops. Tucked inside a book on the nightstand, check the basement. These weren't old notes. The paper was fresh, the handwriting clear. Other guests had been here, had experienced exactly what I was experiencing. And they'd been here for a very long time. Monday morning, except it was Saturday again. Same breakfast conversation, same weather, same everything. Eleanor's confusion seemed genuine when I insisted it was Monday, but the calendar on the kitchen wall showed Saturday, October 14th. This time, instead of going on the hike, I told Thomas I wanted to explore the lodge itself. He seemed uncomfortable with the request, but didn't refuse. Most of the building is off limits to guests, he said. Insurance reasons, you understand. Some areas aren't safe. But when he went to the kitchen, I slipped away and began exploring on my own. The lodge was larger than it seemed from outside, with narrow hallways and hidden staircases that suggested it had been built and rebuilt over many years. Most doors were locked, but I found one that opened to a staircase leading down to what must be the basement. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with stone walls and a dirt floor that felt damp under my feet. Most of it was storage. Old furniture, boxes, the kind of accumulated junk that builds up over generations. But in the back corner, behind a row of filing cabinets, I found something that stopped my heart. Suitcases, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows, old ones and new ones, expensive leather and cheap vinyl. I opened the first one with trembling hands and found clothes, toiletries, a wallet with ID and credit cards belonging to someone named Michael Chen. The ID showed a picture of an Asian man in his 30s, but the date was from 1987. The second suitcase belonged to Sarah Williams, 2003. The third to Robert Martinez, 1994. Decades of guests, their belongings stored down here like trophies. And at the end of the row, a familiar black rolling bag with Miami airport tags. My own suitcase. But I'd brought it upstairs to my room on Friday. I remembered unpacking it, hanging my clothes in the antique wardrobe. I opened it with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My clothes were there, but underneath I found notebooks, journals filled with my own handwriting, documenting days and days of the same Saturday. The entries went back weeks, then months. My own words, describing the same breakfast conversation, the same hike, the same growing realization that I was trapped. The final entry was dated 3 months ago. Day 127. I think I'm losing myself. Some mornings, I wake up and, for a moment, I can't remember who I was before this place. Amanda Torres, attorney, Miami. I have to keep repeating it or I'll forget completely. I'd been here for months, not days, months, and somehow my memory was being reset every loop, letting me experience the horror of realization fresh each time. But the journals proved it. I'd figured it out before, tried to escape before, failed before. I heard footsteps above and shoved the journal into my jacket. When I got back upstairs, Thomas was waiting in the lobby. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my face carefully. "Just admiring the architecture," I lied. "Beautiful building." That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by the window and watched the grounds. At exactly midnight, I saw Thomas and Eleanor leave the building and walk toward the forest. They moved differently than during the day. Smoother, less human. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows. They stopped in a clearing I hadn't seen before, one that hadn't been there during my daytime explorations. In the center was a ring of stones, arranged around what looked like an old well. Eleanor began speaking, but the words weren't English. They were something older, something that seemed to echo strangely in the still air. Thomas threw something into the well, something small that glinted in the moonlight. Then they both stood silent for several minutes before returning to the lodge. I stayed hidden until they were gone, then crept closer to the well. The stones around it were carved with symbols I didn't recognize, worn smooth by decades of weather. When I peered into the well itself, I couldn't see the bottom, just darkness that seemed to go on forever. But I could hear something down there, a sound like whispers, like dozens of voices speaking at once. Tuesday was Saturday again, but this time I was ready. I'd hidden the journal under my mattress, and reading my own words from previous loops, I began to understand what was happening. The Whitmore siblings weren't alive, not in any normal sense. They'd died decades ago, but somehow remained bound to this place, feeding off the life energy of guests who became trapped in temporal loops. According to my journal, I wasn't the first. The basement suitcases were evidence of dozens of others who'd been caught in the same trap. Some had escaped, or at least their belongings suggested they'd moved on. Others had simply vanished, their suitcases growing dusty while their owners became lost in endless repetition. The loops weren't identical, I'd learned. Sometimes they were peaceful, like my first experiences. Sometimes they turned violent, with the staff becoming threatening or other guests appearing, who might be echoes of previous victims. The variation kept the trapped from becoming too comfortable, prevented them from adapting completely. Wednesday, Saturday. I tried to leave. I packed quickly and got to my car before Thomas or Eleanor could stop me. The engine started fine, and I drove back down the winding dirt road toward the main highway. But after what should have been 3 miles, I found myself back at the lodge. The odometer showed I'd driven in a straight line, but somehow the road had curved back on itself. I tried again, watching the compass on my dashboard. No matter which direction I drove, I always ended up back at Whispering Pines. Thursday, Saturday, I confronted them directly. "I know what you are," I told Eleanor over breakfast. "I know about the loops, about the other guests. I know you died decades ago." She smiled sadly and set down her coffee cup. "Oh, my dear Amanda, you've been so clever, figuring it out so quickly each time." "Each time?" "This is your 47th reset," Thomas said, appearing in the doorway. "Most guests take much longer to piece it together. You have quite a sharp mind." "The journals downstairs, I wrote those?" "Every word," Eleanor nodded. "Though you won't remember writing them tomorrow. The loop preserves your first experience, your initial reactions. It keeps things fresh." "Let me go." My voice was steadier than I felt. "You've had your fun. Let me leave." "We don't control the loop, dear," Thomas said gently. "We're as trapped as you are. We died in 1923 in a fire that consumed the original lodge. But something about this place, something in the land itself, wouldn't let us go. We've been caretakers here ever since, maintaining the illusion, caring for guests who become permanent residents. There has to be a way out." Eleanor and Thomas exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. "There is," Eleanor said finally. "But it requires sacrifice. Someone must choose to stay, to take our place as caretakers. Only then can the others go free. And if I refuse, then Saturday continues," Thomas said simply. "Forever. Though I should warn you, the loops aren't sustainable indefinitely. Eventually, the repetition begins to degrade the mind. We've had guests who've been here for decades, and they're no longer quite themselves." That night, I found the most recent addition to the basement collection, a journal from someone named David Kim, dated just 6 months ago. His handwriting started clear and neat, but deteriorated as the entries progressed. By the end, it was barely legible, filled with rambling accounts of conversations with people who weren't there, descriptions of the lodge changing around him, paranoid theories about the staff. The final entry was just one line, repeated over and over. Saturday, 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 Saturday. Friday, Saturday. I tried to destroy whatever was maintaining the loop. I found the ritual circle in the forest and began breaking the stones, throwing them as far as I could into the trees. But as soon as I disturbed the circle, everything around me began to flicker and shift. The trees aged and withered in seconds, then returned to full bloom. The sky cycled from day to night to day again in moments. I saw glimpses of other time periods, men in old-fashioned work clothes cutting down trees, the lodge as it must have looked when new, the fire Thomas and Eleanor had mentioned. I ran back toward the lodge as reality came apart around me. The building flickered between different versions of itself. The original mansion, the burned ruin, the current renovation. I saw other guests from different eras, all looking confused and frightened, all trapped in their own versions of the same loop. When I reached my room, everything stabilized. But I knew I'd seen the truth. This place was like scar tissue over some old wound, keeping multiple time periods bound together in an unnatural knot. Saturday, the 48th Saturday, I made my decision. I found Thomas and Eleanor in the dining room, setting up for the breakfast I'd experienced dozens of times. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll take your place. Let the others go." They looked at me with something like relief, but also profound sadness. "Are you certain?" Eleanor asked. "It's not a decision you can unmake." "I'm certain." Thomas nodded slowly. "The transition happens at midnight. Meet us at the circle. And Amanda, thank you." But as the day wore on, I began to doubt. Reading through my journal one final time, I found entries I'd forgotten about, attempts I'd made to find another way. In one, I'd discovered that the loop wasn't powered by the land itself, but by some kind of artifact buried in the well. In another, I'd found references to a ritual that could break the cycle entirely, but required destroying something the Whitmores valued more than their freedom. With an hour to midnight, I went back to the basement and searched more thoroughly. Behind a loose stone in the wall, I found a metal box containing old photographs. Pictures of the Whitmores when they were alive, family photos, wedding pictures. But one photo caught my attention. Thomas and Eleanor with two small children, a boy and a girl who looked just like them. Their children. The Whitmores had children who died in the same fire, children they'd been trying to protect for a century by maintaining the loop. The lodge wasn't just their prison, it was their children's grave, and they couldn't bear to let it go. I understood then why they'd been so sad when I offered to take their place. They knew I was just buying time, that eventually I'd figure out what they couldn't bring themselves to do. Someone had to choose to end it all, to let the dead finally die, even if it meant losing the last connection to their children. At 11:50, I went to the circle with the photographs. Thomas and Eleanor were already there, dressed in clothes from the 1920s I hadn't seen before. They looked younger somehow, more like they must have when they were alive. "The ritual won't work if we're unwilling," Eleanor said quietly. "We have to choose to let go." I held up the photographs. "These are what's keeping you here, isn't it? Not the lodge, not the land. Them." Thomas's face crumpled. "They were so young. Sarah was 8, Michael was 6. We couldn't save them from the fire. But here they could play in the forests forever, always safe, always children." "But they're not children anymore," I said gently. "They're not anything. You're keeping ghosts of ghosts alive and trapping innocent people to do it." Eleanor was crying now, tears that looked silver in the moonlight. "How do we say goodbye? How do we let them go again?" "The same way parents always do," I said. "With love." At midnight, we burned the photographs. As the flames consumed the images, I felt something shift in the air around us, like a held breath finally being released. The circle of stones cracked and crumbled. The well filled itself with earth that bubbled up from below. Thomas and Eleanor became translucent, their forms wavering like heat mirages. "Thank you," Thomas whispered, "for giving us the courage to do what we should have done long ago." They faded completely just as dawn broke. A real dawn, not the artificial repetition I'd grown accustomed to. The date on my phone showed Monday, October 16th. I packed quickly and drove away from Whispering Pines Lodge for the final time. In my rearview mirror, I could see the building aging rapidly, decades of delayed decay catching up in minutes. By the time I reached the main road, nothing remained but foundation stones and memories. The drive back to Miami should have taken 2 days. Instead, it took a week. I kept having to stop, to rest, to convince myself that each new day was actually new. The world felt fragile, like it might slip back into repetition at any moment. When I finally reached home, I found stacks of mail, dozens of voicemails, and a missing person report that had been filed 3 months earlier. 3 months. My assistant, my partners, my family. They'd all been looking for me. The police investigation was still active. I tried to explain what had happened, but how do you tell people you were trapped in a time loop at a haunted lodge? The detective assigned to my case was professional, but skeptical. Without evidence, without the lodge still existing, my story sounded like the delusion of someone who'd had a breakdown and blocked out months of her life. My therapist thinks I experienced some kind of dissociative episode brought on by stress and overwork. The missing time could be explained by a fugue state, she says, where trauma causes the mind to shut down and wander. It's not uncommon in high achievers who push themselves too hard. Maybe she's right. Maybe I never left Miami, never found Whispering Pines Lodge, never met Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore. Maybe I spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility somewhere, living the same nightmare over and over in my head, while my body recovered from a complete mental breakdown. But if that's true, then why did I find that handwritten note in my purse when I got home? The one in my own handwriting that said, "Day 1247. I think I'm getting close to finding the way out." And why last week did I receive a booking confirmation email for Whispering Pines Lodge, an email dated for next weekend, showing a reservation I never made, for a place that doesn't exist anymore? I deleted the email, but it came back. I blocked the sender, but it appeared again from a different address. I changed my email entirely, but somehow, it still finds me. If you're still listening to this, you probably enjoy stories like mine. Stories that make you question what's real and what's not. A like or comment helps keep these experiences alive, helps other people know they're not alone when reality starts to feel uncertain. The confirmation emails keep coming. Every few days, a new one, always for the same weekend, always for Whispering Pines Lodge. My therapist says it's probably spam, some kind of computer glitch that's feeding off old reservation data. But yesterday, I found myself looking up directions to Aroostook County. Not consciously, I just realized I was sitting at my computer with a map open, a route planned for a place that shouldn't exist anymore. Part of me wonders if I really escaped it all, or if this is just another variation of the loop. Maybe I'm still sitting in room 5. Maybe it's still Saturday, October 14th. And this entire experience, coming home, the missing person report, the therapy sessions, is just my mind trying to convince itself that it found a way out. The scary thing is, I'm not sure I'd know the difference. How can you tell if you're living in reality or trapped in a very convincing dream? How do you know if today is actually today or just another Saturday in an endless chain of Saturdays? I guess that's what makes it real horror. Not knowing, not being sure, living with the possibility that everything you think you know about your life might be an illusion. Sometimes I wake up and, for just a moment, I expect to see Eleanor in the hallway, setting up for breakfast. I expect to hear Thomas talking about the local wildlife and offering to show me that waterfall for the 49th time. And sometimes, in that space between sleeping and waking, I'm almost disappointed when I don't. Some say the loop ended that night when we burned those photographs, but I still wake up checking my calendar, counting the days to make sure they're different, making sure time is still moving forward. Because once you've lived the same day over and over, once you've seen how thin the line is between reality and repetition, you never stop watching for the cracks. Thanks for listening, if you made it through to the end. And if you ever get an email about Whispering Pines Lodge, maybe think twice before you click accept.